All right, everybody, looks like we're live, I think. It's all frozen up. All right, now it looks like we're back up and running. How is everybody doing? Welcome to Drawing Together. I am Scott, this is Artist Network, and we are here to draw together. Today we are working on this image of fruit, very simple still life, kind of going back to our roots. This is a subject that we tackled early on in this series. So I thought I'd give it another go and see if there's any improvements, what I've kind of learned throughout the series. So relatively simple subject, but I think that's really important for us to continue to explore these things and see how we can push it a little bit farther. So if you are new, you're going to want to know that you can find the reference image in the link below and follow along if you'd like. Check out all the other resources at artistnetwork.com. So if you go to artistnetwork.com, at the very top, you'll see the Drawing Together kind of logo. You link to that, and that takes you to a page that has a list of all the episodes. So it's going to show like which ones are upcoming, the live streams, and then below that you're going to see a list of all the different subjects that we cover. When you click on those, you will then be able to find the individual show pages that that allow you to participate. You can share your work, comment on other people's work, and see what everybody's working on. So you're going to notice that I've got a slightly different setup here. I'm standing for this one today. I'm playing around with different ways to help with my back and shoulders. I've noticed that throughout this series, we're almost up to 50 episodes already. The sitting on a stool working at the surface has been tough on my back and shoulders. So I'm going to give this a shot and see how that works out. Hopefully it's all set up properly so that I'm not dipping into the shots as well. So today we're working with charcoal. This is the preparatory one that I did, and I was a little hesitant to share this with you all because I'm not very happy with it. I don't think it turned out all that great, but it was a really good learning experience. And this kind of plays into a question that you all have had or comments that you've made about the paper itself. So in this one, this is a smoother surface, and I was using a harder charcoal, and it was limited in its ability to get dark, and you can see in some of these areas it just wasn't doing much, and all it was doing was scratching the paper, and then it just kind of stained it, and it made it very difficult to erase in some areas. It's just kind of a flat looking drawing. So with this one, I'm switching things up a little bit. I'm going to be going to my rag paper. It's the Hanamula rag paper. Do I have that here? Yeah, it's this stuff that I really like. Now it's not easy to find, but if you do a search, you might online, you might be able to find this, or really any other pure cotton rag paper is a good thing to test out and see how it works for you. For some people, they just don't really like it at all. I really love rag paper because it's just a different surface than other kind of charcoal specific paper. And so Vicky, you're asking, could the former episodes be listed in chronological order? Yeah, the best way to find the chronological order is to go through the playlist on YouTube. So there is a Drawing Together playlist that you can find, and in the descriptions, all the titles or all the descriptions should have the order number there, the episode number, and I believe they're in chronological order. If not, I'll go through the settings and see if we can set it up that way. But that's a good point, and I can bring that to the team and see if we want to organize them in chronology. So let's see. So yeah, I'll see if I can find some additional resources for you for that as well. So okay, other materials. I'm going to keep it relatively simple. This is a 4B pencil. The HB that I was using to do the study just wasn't working for me. And that was kind of a shock in a way because that's what I had used so much before, but I think throughout the series I've been using the 4Bs and the 6Bs so much that I've just kind of gotten used to it. I've got my 2 rubber erasers, my standard rubber eraser, but then I have this mono. It's got a rubber and a sanded portion that I've been really enjoying. I've got my kneaded eraser here that's starting to get a little dark, but it's going to work out just well. Plus 2 shading stumps. So I'll probably get away with just using my old one, but I do have a new one in case I need it. So again, relatively simple. I don't want to be switching up between materials for this one. I just want to go straight for it. So if you're all ready, let's go. If you have any questions, and if you're new, typing things in all caps is how I prefer the questions to come through, so that I can find them more easily. So if you think, why are people yelling? It's not. It's my direction so that I can see the questions. That was a suggestion from one of you very early on, and I found it very helpful. So thank you all. So I just want to do a quick scan of the threads here to see if are there any other questions. If not, we're going to dig right into it. I have the reference image right up here to my left, so you're not able to see it. One of the reasons I chose to stand for this as well is to help me get a better vantage point on the work as I'm going. I'm a bit more direct on the image now than when I'm seated. And that's something that I kind of recommend for all of you. The best option would be to stand at an easel. The challenge I've had in this current setup is that with a vertical surface, it's hard to get really a good camera angle on that, where I'm not blocking the shot regularly or distorting the perspective from your point of view. So in order to square it up in the camera, I found that this seems to be the best way to do it. So we'll just see how it works, but we'll continue to play around with it. All right. Welcome if you're new. It's good to see some new faces here. I see a lot of the familiar faces. I love joining you all here today. We meet every Monday, Wednesday, 3 p.m. Eastern. I just set up my upcoming subjects, so I'm really excited for those as well. So this one, we're just going to get started. I have been I've been feeling the urge to work kind of more atmospherically for some reason, and that's the way I approached the first go around, and I want to try it for this one as well, which is one of the reasons why I was kind of pulled towards working on this rag paper. The rag paper kind of lends itself to working in blocks of value. It's looking a little bright. Let me tone this down a little bit. There, you might be able to see that. So as you can see, I've taken a razor blade and I've carved away the wood casing to expose about an inch and a half of the core of the pencil, and it allows me to really engage the side of the charcoal more effectively. And you can see what a large area that allows me. And I'm trying to build up these large areas of value and identify the forms this way, rather than drawing a line first and then filling it in. And let me see, I want to see how it's all framed up. This is also helping me to think about the composition. I think I do want to place this that main focal point, that lemon in the foreground. I want to kind of place properly. Let's see. And as I'm doing this, I'm rolling the pencil. It's something that we talk about a lot in this series. This is kind of gradually rolling with each pass. It's kind of rolling in my fingers so that I'm keeping that charcoal rounded. I'm not creating in these flat spots that could affect the marks that I'm making. I'm locking my wrist and really drawing with the arm more than anything. And very quickly, I'm trying to get at a point where I can see these as shapes. And one of the things that can be challenging when drawing contour lines first and then filling it in is that we interpret the forms of objects when they're in linear form. We interpret that differently than when we see them as values. And I feel like it's ultimately more effective for me to find the shapes first, and then I'll bring in lines later to help refine those forms. Right now, it's all about just trying to find those major forms. And if you're new, when I'm talking about contour lines, what a contour line is, it's the line that we use to define the edge of a three-dimensional object. And that's typically the way drawing is taught, and it's a natural instinct for us to draw a line that represents the outer edge of an object, and then we fill that in. But what I'm saying through all of this, and why I'm approaching it this way, is that when we do that, we're starting from a point where we're defining those edges, and we're seeing those objects don't quite have a visual weight, and we interpret that differently than when we see it as a shape. And for me, I feel like if we can get to that shape first more quickly, it can ultimately become more effective in maintaining and refining the form, the composition, and the proportions of the objects. And then lines can be brought in later to continue to refine the edge, bring some clarity to an edge, add some expression, and such. But sometimes if we start with that line, it can be difficult to overcome that later on and get rid of them. And if you're going for realism in a drawing, getting rid of the lines is really helpful, because lines don't exist in nature. They're symbolic constructions that we've developed as humans to represent the edge of an object. And one of the other advantages that, if you've been with us for a while, you'll have heard me say this quite a bit as well, is that one of the reasons I like to start with using the side of the pencil and thinking in terms of shape is that when we hold a pencil like this and we engage the point of the pencil in the paper, it tends to emboss a line on the page that's very difficult to manage later. It leaves those marks that we end up having to fight throughout the rest of the drawing. This allows us to float the charcoal on top of the paper more. We're going to be able to erase it more easily and work with these marks and adjust them more effectively. The other thing I'm thinking about doing is I'm trying to define the shape of the light and the shadow early on, so that everything gets unified by the light and the shadow, and we can pull the forms out of that light and shadow. But we're starting from a point of unity, and then we're gradually going to be defining them and separating them, rather than starting from a point where everything is separated and then gradually try to unify them through value. So just changing up the direction of my marks, building up these values. And now in previous episodes, I would have been doing this using vine charcoal, but I decided for this, I'm just going to keep it simple and use a single pencil for this whole drawing. All right, I see this comment here, defining edges this way is new to me, but makes sense suddenly. All right, well, I'm glad that makes sense. Edges are really an important thing in art. The decisions you make around edges is an artistic choice that becomes part of your identity, and it says something about how we interpret the objects. So as you can see, what's happening in here is I haven't defined this bottom edge of this background orange. I've let the value of that surface blend into that cast shadow on that orange. Now, this is a concept that we discussed very early on in the series, and I think it's worth repeating here that there are three main terms when we're discussing shadows. There's the form shadow, there's the cast shadow, and there's the shadow shape. When we're looking at the value shifts on an object, so if we're looking at this foreground lemon, for example, we can see a distinct area where there's light and shadow. That shadow that's on the lemon, that's called the form shadow. Now it's casting a shadow onto the orange behind it, so that's the cast shadow. You can blend those together, and often those will form what's called a shadow shape, a combination of the cast and form shadow. So down in here, for example, that lemon is casting a bit of a shadow on that surface and the orange, and we can combine that together as a single shadow shape, and then we can, from that, define that farther as we need to. Now what I'm doing here, as you can see, is I'm just kind of smoothing things out with a pad of my hand. I'm trying not to use my fingertips, which are oilier. Some people just use a paper towel or something else to blend, but I prefer just to use my hands Just I think that's really more of my personal preference, but you do have to be careful with the oils of the fingers there. Let me see, so just checking here. This is a charcoal pencil. This is a 4B. I see a question. WTF is up with that pencil? So I just have carved it. I've shaved it down to expose the core, and it just gives me more charcoal to work with. And I can tip it on the side like this and cover a broad area more easily than when using the point of a pencil. And something that's mechanically sharpened, like you can see on this end, I used a mechanical sharpener. And there's just only now a 1/4 inch or so of that charcoal exposed versus, you know, 1 inch to 1.5 inches here. So I can keep moving. And if I keep using the side of the pencil like this throughout the drawing, I'm always preserving a sharp point that can be used for fine detail when I need it. But if I start this way and all I'm allowing myself to use is the point of the pencil, very quickly I've worn that down, and I'm constantly sharpening the pencil, and when I need it sharpened, it's not there. This way, I'm not worrying about that at all. You can see how atmospheric the edges are becoming already. And just by doing that, it starts to create the suggestion of a 3-dimensional form. It's one of the reasons why edges are so important. You know, we're working on a 2-dimensional surface, right? You know, and if we're going for realism, then the objective is to try to create the illusion of 3 dimensions on a 2-dimensional surface. The way we treat the edges is critical in terms of conveying the illusion of 3 dimensions. And if it's a hard, consistent line around the edge of an object, that's typically going to work against that. So it's going to make things more flat if you create a hard, consistent edge. We want variation in the edges, and we want to control our line work. Now you can see I'm going to go right over this. I'm building up a haze over that. I'm not worried about preserving the bright white. And I'm going to keep doing that, building up these areas, and I can start building up some value in here. I'm looking for any directional marks that may be appearing in this area. Right now it's really mostly picking up the tooth of the paper. But if I'm seeing any distinct marks and directional marks in that area, I want to be mindful of that, because I want any of those marks to actually reinforce the dimension of the fruit. I want it to follow the cross contour, the form of of that fruit. It does look a bit like Mickey Mouse. Yeah, so Aisha is asking a question about how to demonstrate the sharpened pencil. I can just show that real quickly. I've got my razor blade here, and it's really just as simple as this. So I just take a razor blade and I'm pushing with this thumb, I'm pushing forward through up to the end. Now, you want to be a little careful as you get right up to the core of the pencil, because there can sometimes be kind of chunks of like an adhesive or something that helps hold the wood casing to the charcoal. And you do want to have a very sharp blade. If it becomes too dull, then it increases the likelihood that you'll break the core of that pencil. So, so basically that's all I do, is just kind of push it up to the edge there and go like that. And then I might put this end into a pencil sharpener, or you can kind of shave it down using the razor blade here, or sometimes just use a piece of sandpaper and I'll rub it on the sandpaper just like I'm doing here to sharpen it that way. So it's relatively simple, but I enjoy working this way. You know, if I don't have a razor blade and all I have is a mechanically sharpened pencil like this, then, you know, that's what you use. You never want to allow that, you know, to inhibit your ability to draw. But again, it's just what's working for me. Yes, Samin, I feel like going from out to in lets us capture fundamental shapes and shadows in a composition, unlike starting from one point and later exploring what to do next. Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. One of the things that we talk a lot about in this series is the idea of building up the whole image at once, rather than finishing as we go. We're starting from a point of unity where everything is being established, and then we're gradually refining. And there's many advantages to that. The primary advantage is that it kind of ensures that everything remains unified. If we finish an area and then we move to another area and finish that, and move to another area and finish that, there's a chance that each of those areas becomes segmented. They don't quite fit together. And this kind of helps prevent that. It also helps to give us time to really understand what we're looking at. When we look at a new subject, we haven't taken the time to really absorb all the subtle nuances of that form, of the forms there, of the composition, the proportions, etc. And so we can allow our drawing to reflect the evolution of our own observations, in that our drawings may start very general and then become more and more specific as we gather information about the subject. It also helps to ensure that we can be in control of how much detail we add to it, because if I start from a high level of detail, it kind of locks me into that level of detail for the rest of the drawing. But that may not be for everybody. There are some times when I just don't want to put the detail into work, or some days when I want to add even more detail. I'm really in that mood, but it's not always the case that it has to be, everything has to be brought up to a high level of detail. So in terms of pressure on the pencil, I'm not putting a whole lot of pressure right now. It's pretty much just the weight of it, and if I need to, I can kind of lean into it a little bit more. But one of the advantages to holding my pencil this way is that I can kind of roll my hand up to engage the point if I need a sharper edge, and I can lay it down when I need a more broad swath of value. I'm just going to use, in some of these areas, just use kind of circular marks, again, to help avoid creating any marks that would affect the texture of the orange here. Nia is saying, is it okay if my background is looking more grainy? Is there a way I can blend it better? Can I go over my background with Vine Charcoal to smooth it out? I think, yeah, Vine Charcoal on top of this would actually do a good job with that. You may, I think, I haven't brought out my shading stump, but that's going to do the same thing as well. And as you're suggesting, there's natural tooth to the paper that's creating some texture, and I think that's going to really work out well for the fruit. And I don't think I want to blend in those areas, but in terms of creating that contrast, smoothing out that background might be really helpful, and it'll create a contrast in texture. I might wait to do that until a little bit later, though. But if you're doing that now, it might be good to kind of report to the group and see how that's working for you. One of the things I'm starting to see is some variations in the kind of the surface of the lemon here, and I'm allowing my marks just to kind of become irregular, and I'm thinking about the three-dimensional form. So you can see as I'm moving my pencil along this kind of cross contour of the lemon. I'm not making distinct lines, and I'm just still using the side of the pencil, but I'm trying to think through that cross contour. The cross contour refers to the marks we make inside the edges of the object to define its three-dimensional form. I'm just putting a little bit of thought into this form right here. I want to identify the axis kind of for each of these. Make sure, at least in my head, I know where they are, to see if that's going to be helpful in creating the form. and if you're kind of working along in this process, it may be a little weird, but hopefully what you're seeing is the idea that it's kind of slowly emerging on the page, like as though it's like an old photograph, being developed. I don't know. I remember being in dark rooms when I was learning photography that I was never very good at, but when I was learning photography, being in the dark room and you put the negatives, or you put your print in the developing fluid, and you see it just kind of gradually emerge. That's the way I start to think of the process here, is that the image is emerging on the page, which is, again, one of the things we've talked about here as well, is that we're here to draw, but the word draw has so many different meanings, and I like to contemplate that. In general, to draw means to pull out, or to pull together, and that's essentially the way I view this art making process, is the idea that we're pulling the image out onto the surface here. It's almost like you're imagining it's there, and now it's just taking some time to see it, and it is gradually emerging on the surface. Okay, I'm just checking here through some of the comments here, seeing if there are any questions, but it doesn't look like it. Now, one of the things in terms of drawing this way, is starting from this really kind of atmospheric position. My eyes are essentially oriented this way as well. So when I look at the subject, I'm coming at it through very blurred eyes. When we focus on something, it tends to distort it, and we need that focus, we need that detail for certain phases. But I think one of the things you learn, especially through observational drawing, is to be in control of that. What can happen is that when we focus on an area, its importance it shifts. So focusing on, say, if we're looking at this stem right here, if I focus on that, in my mind, that's taking up a much larger portion of my concentration. And what can happen sometimes is that our brain kind of confuses that with its physical size. It's saying it's bigger it's taking up a bigger space in my mind, so it must be drawn bigger. And so when we're thinking, we're letting our eyes kind of lose focus and take in the whole image, then it's easier to see the overall proportions. It's the forest and trees kind of situation here. We're trying to see the whole forest. Again, I think this needs to come down a little bit. And as you can see here, like now that I can see this as a shape, I can start to make some really quick adjustments to its overall form. So it's good to see some new faces here. So if you are new and you haven't chimed in, give us a shout out, see where you're viewing from. We get people from all over the world here. I'm based out of Colorado here, one of the homes of Artist Network. It's another beautiful day here. All right, let's see, what do we do next? So as we start to get through, at some point we're going to say, all right, I've got the whole context established enough that we can focus on specific detail. So what I'm doing right now is I'm assessing that. And I'm also looking to see if compositionally how everything's holding up. We have this fruit seated on this fabric, and there's a distinct kind of rectangular form there. I need to see if that's something that's important or not. One of the things that's also kind of interesting, and I haven't talked about this before, but so I actually have two reference images in front of me. I've got the main reference image that I'm using. It's on a big screen right here. And now in the screen in front of me, I can see what this camera is doing. I can see the drawing, but I can also see a small reference image. This is what you are seeing on the screen, is that small image that's below me right now. The value structure in the small one is a little bit different than what I'm seeing in the large one. I can see the distinct shapes of light and shadow a little bit more easily with the smaller reference image. And so that may be something that you play around with as well, is try shrinking that reference photo down to see how that changes your interpretation of the forms. It's very similar to what we do with our drawings when we step back from them. So if you haven't taken that time yet to step back from your work, I think that would be important. I can't do that here. I'm kind of tightly confined to the space, but I can by looking at the screen in front of me that shows the drawing. It's equivalent to holding the drawing up at about 10 feet distance from me, because it's shrunken down into that small screen in front of me. So take some time to check it out from a distance and use that to evaluate your value structure in the forms there. And as we go through, we're going to talk a bit about a light and shadow structure. Now with this one, we don't have really distinct highlights and shadows, but I think what we'll discuss is some key terms that might be helpful to observe. New from Germany, Reina. Welcome, welcome. New from Netherlands as well, San Antonio. Another Texas. Donna is saying, what details will I add? That's where I think I'm just going to be getting into that. I was kind of in my mind just kind of thinking through, am I at the point right now where I can really focus? And I think I am. I'm looking at the major forms and they feel like they're pretty well established. What I can do now is I can work from the background forward. In the preparatory one that I had created, I had kind of diminished the lemon, and as a result, is like the focal point became all three of them at once, and that felt a little flat. So I want to control the details a little bit, and maybe put a bit more emphasis on the lemon in this. But I think I still need to add a little bit more detail to these others here. Now that I feel like I got a basic understanding of the forms here, though, let me see, what do I want to do? I think this is when I can bring out the shading stump. I need to be really careful here. So you can see this one's already still a bit loaded with material from previous drawings. And I talked earlier about how I really like the tooth of the paper and how it helps to convey the texture of the fruit. So I need to be really subtle with this, because I'm not really blending marks now. I want to use this shading stump as a way to create and detail and contribute to the form, not lose the texture and the tooth of the paper. So I want to just be mindful of that. So as I'm going through, I'm finding the stem here, and I'm looking for some of these forms. I'm just using the weight of this shading stump. And I'm going to kind of build from the outer edges and try to round it out. And as we go up along the edge here, we can see some bounce light up and this along this edge. What I need to do is evaluate its brightness compared to the brightest spot, which is over here. And if I look at this area, but put my awareness on this light, this doesn't quite feel as bright as this. Now when I look at this, if I focus on this area, it feels pretty bright. But in order to evaluate its value, I need to look here, but put my awareness on this. And that's a large part of the drawing process for me, is is kind of splitting my attention. I may be looking in one spot, but I'm thinking about another area. And sometimes we can interpret the actual value of something more easily when we look at it indirectly. I remember reading books on neuroaesthetics, and there are descriptions of why that happens. It has to do with the structure of our retina and the way our brain processes visual information. But a lot of the indirect gaze is kind of an important thing in observational painting and drawing. So I want to kind of describe, though, what that means to me, at least, and see if it helps you at all. But all right, Nia, good luck on that second attempt. Thanks for sharing that. And then Pamela's asking about cotton rag paper and the advantages. So I really enjoy using it. I got kind of hooked on it through printmaking as I was learning intaglio printmaking processes. It's a paper that's made from cotton fibers rather than wood pulp. So typically we're used to working on paper that is made from wood, but with the cotton paper, there's less of that. So it typically becomes more naturally acid-free, which from a conservation standpoint is generally good. What I like about it, though, is that there's kind of the surface quality is a little bit different. It has kind of a softer quality to it, a different type of grain. Sometimes like a charcoal paper itself will have like a distinct tooth, a distinct texture that almost feels too consistent for me. And then what happens is when I'm erasing, you can actually kind of file off some fine layers of the fibers in a cotton rag paper. So I find that I can get back to the brighter white a little bit more easily than with some other papers. But you want to play around with it to see what works best for you. So some of these cotton papers, the ones that I started using a paper called Rives BFK that I used for printmaking, and it has a sizing in it. So basically a little bit of like a glue that holds all the fibers together so that when you soak the paper, it doesn't just fall apart. Soaking the paper in an intaglio printmaking process is an important part of that process. So hopefully that makes sense. All right, Adele's saying the lighting in the room is giving you some trouble today. That's a good thing to kind of be aware of. All right, so I'm going to keep working this edge here in some of these areas. I think what I need to do is I need to get this stem done though first, because what can happen, being selective in those details, there's a question, was that Pamela that asked that question about, how do I, what details am I going to choose? That can be really important sometimes, because sometimes you can add just the right detail, add detail to just the right area, and find that it gives enough information for the mind to accept it, and in the mind itself will fill in the rest of the information. And in this case, I feel like if I get the stem right, I may not actually have to add much additional detail. The brain will look at this and say, oh, I understand that as an orange, and it just kind of fills in the rest of that detail. There's a question about cotton paper. Yes, so this is a cotton rag paper. So what I'm doing under here is I'm working on that stem. I'm seeing some subtle variations in value in the orange just behind that stem. So I want to get that established so that then I can layer that stem in on top. And I'm going to start from the base of that orange and build out from there. Now, there is kind of an elliptical quality to that, but it's not a pure ellipse. So I'm trying to see both of those forms as well and make sure that I've got it placed in the right spot and it's generally the right shape. And now I'm evaluating its size. You know, what's nice about this is that I can be off a little bit and it's probably going to be okay. So you want to decide for yourself what your tolerance is for kind of inaccuracy. Does it have to be 100% accurate? Can it, you know, be close enough? You know, what does close enough mean to you? Those are types of decisions that you as the artist get to be in control of. Now, as I'm working on the stem, I want to be careful not to outline that stem. That's going to flatten things out. I want to continue to build this as an expression of light and shadow. So I'm actually going to work kind of on the underside where I think there's a little bit more shadow. It kind of wraps around into the shadow. Kind of give myself some subtle suggestions. And then do some negative drawing. So as I find that form of the stem, rather than draw the stem itself, I'm going to draw that shape that's seen through this form here. And then the same with the shape below it. And then kind of feather it out. I think already I can feel that I'm happier with this version than what I did with the one at the start of the video. Like I said, I was a little hesitant to even show it because it was it was a good learning experience, I'll tell you that. But that's really part of the whole drawing process. So I hope you guys are being kind to yourself when you're making this. I know sometimes it can be there can be pressure to feel like you have to get every drawing 100% right. But for me, drawing is a continual process. You're always going to get better. You always want to have something that you can improve on. That's so much of what pulls me into art making, is that knowing that, you know, I did a drawing or I did a painting, I completed something that I'm mostly happy with, but not quite. There's something I feel like I could have done better, and that's that kind of what if that kind of pulls you forward. So I was actually a bit more excited to do this drawing again because I had that failed attempt and I kind of wanted to redeem myself a bit, and I saw some potential there, and I'm gonna give this a shot. And who knows, you know, maybe it's a thing where I'm like, oh, I think I could do it even better next time. And you can see doing some negative drawing, just some very subtle variations in here, and that stem is starting to form naturally. Now our eyes are really good at perceiving subtle shifts in value, so we can, you know, we can give that to the viewer's mind, right? You know, we can tell their brain to say, yeah, you know, you really enjoy seeing these subtle shifts. Why don't you go play with that a little bit? We have a tendency to feel like we have to make everything clear and explicit, but sometimes then it, you know, the viewer's minds, they don't necessarily want to have it be easy. They're looking for kind of challenges, looking for ways to engage in the process. So in order to make that stem more clear, again, I'm just darkening that background a bit more. Like I said, I felt compelled in this drawing to kind of work more atmospherically, and so that's a specific approach that I kind of moved into with intention for this drawing. It could have gone a different way entirely. Raina is saying, when I try to draw something and not become what I want to see in my eye, start to destroy the paper. Yeah, it's, I don't know, drawing is, one of the things, again, I like to remind my students, and it's a mantra that I give myself, is to remind myself that marks are thoughts. This is a system, you know, of the outside world being processed through our brain and then coming through onto the paper. It's all one kind of thing. And so we're seeing a physical manifestation of what's happening in our minds right now. And sometimes when I go to a drawing, I have more focus than others. Sometimes I did that with a painting not too long ago. I was out there and my brain was just chewing on some other problem, and that painting did not come together very well at all because I wasn't focused on the painting. I wasn't making the painting. I was actively painting, but I was doing something else. So my brain was somewhere else. All right, so now I'm almost actually done with this. It doesn't look like a whole lot at this point. So now what I'm looking at is I'm trying to figure out if I were to add any additional detail, what would it be? And I think all I need to do is make this look more three-dimensional. There's this little white kind of tip there. So if I kind of sharpen up this edge here and feather it out, and then what I'll do is I'm going to take my kneaded eraser, I'm going to refine it down into this point, kind of place it right against there, and just give it a slight kind of vibration there. That pulls that out, and now it's too large, so I can come back in with my my pencil and kind of refine that down a little bit. Actually, I should have used my shading stump so that I don't overstate that value. And now I made that too dark, so now I can come back in with my kneaded eraser and tap this out. And as I'm lifting up this value, I want to be mindful of where the core of the that stem is. So I want to pull up that value right in the center of that, so then it continues to feel like it's rounded, like there's a three-dimensional quality to it. So that edge is really soft. I don't know if I can zoom in. There, you can kind of see that a little bit better. It's hard to, I can't quite move things around. It's going to be in block there. There we go. And now, if I'm generally I'm happier with this so far. What I want to do is this area here that I feel like there's an opportunity to really reinforce that form. So I'm kind of trying to think through what that form is, and I observe the cross contour. And then right in here, I feel like really all I need to do is just get darker. And I'm just circular marks across the surface of the paper. I want that tooth to become a factor that makes it feel more like an orange. So when I'm thinking about the contour, right, we can kind of I just made a new word, visualize the marks that would be created if I were to run this pencil over the surface of the orange. And we can do that in multiple directions. And so there are kind of lateral cross contour, and then there are the kind of longitudinal and latitudinal marks that we can kind of make. And there's no real kind of right or wrong there, but just try to build an intuition for your marks that suggest that three-dimensional form. So I just want to avoid creating kind of diagonal or vertical hatch marks. Instead, I want to use curves that help to reinforce that form. And I'm letting the tooth of the paper create the texture. I'm not, really fighting that texture. I'm not going to get bogged down in that detail. I want to suggest it as much as possible. I feel like texture is ultimately best interpreted by the mind when it's suggested rather than explicitly rendered. All right, so I'm just looking at that background orange, giving it a little bit some more distance. And now what I'm doing is I'm evaluating the edges. If I follow along the contour, that edge is constantly changing, which is good. But there's an area like up in here where it feels a little bit more ambiguous. So I think this is an opportunity to kind of clarify that. So mostly doing the negative drawing by working on that background space working up to that edge and creating a sharper edge when I need it, letting it become more diffused in other areas. But edge variation is really an important tool for creating the illusion of realism. Having value, color, textural shifts along an edge really helps to add to the realism. Now, that kind of sharpens it up a little bit while still maintaining that three-dimensional quality. What I need to do, and I can see it more clearly in the small thumbnail reference image, is that there's more of a distinct shadow over here. When I'm using the shading stump, and again, I've mentioned this before, so if you're new, you wouldn't have heard this, but with whatever tool you're using, in this case I'm using the shading stump, that's an opportunity to contribute to the form. Even though kind of it's, as a tool, it's designed to smooth out your marks, it's doing that, but you can use that in such a way that it also contributes to the form. It becomes another mark-making tool. And the same can be said of erasers. Erasers are tools for correcting mistakes, but they're also opportunities to contribute to the form. So just kind of keep that in mind as you're going. And so if I keep this shading stump, if I keep it kind of in my hand lightly, I can still retain the kind of the tooth of the paper. Right in here, I think I need to make that darker. Too much bounce light down in here. I'm kind of liking the way that orange is just falling into that shadow there. Now, and what I was also looking at is that there's a bit of a bounce light back in here. Before I do anything about that right now, I feel like right now I'm kind of losing it. Before I do that, I want to start to pull out that highlight. My eyes are calibrating to the values of the paper there, which I need to remind myself because I got rid of the bright white of the paper. Early on when I toned this, like when I wiped it down with my hand, I applied a tone to the white of the paper. So what I see here now as white is not white. I can get a little bit brighter. I need to just be mindful of that. And just as I did earlier where I looked here but put my awareness here, I want to do that with this. This is going to be my brightest spot. So I want to try to evaluate that value relative to this. I'm going to do that by studying the reference image, looking at this area here, but putting my awareness on this. And I realize that actually is really quite dark in value. So I'm going to let that sit there. My instinct originally was to start to erase out that bounce light. But that's an error that I see many beginning students make, is once you become aware of that bounce light or reflected light in a shadow, there's a tendency to want to overstate that. It's actually very, very subtle. So I'm kind of starting from the center point of that brightest spot there. I'm just lightly tapping, lifting up some of the charcoal. And I'm kind of tapping because it helps to create that texture. So one of the things I love about the kneaded eraser is it kind of lends itself to making all sorts of unique marks. How do I feel about that? I guess that feels okay. All right. So I'm going to let that sit. I feel like that's rendered sufficiently at this point. This is becoming a distraction, that white spot. So I'm going to darken that. I'm liking being able to stand. I can move around the image in a way that I haven't been able to throughout this series when I've been locked onto my stool. All right, so patience. Any tips for lefties? That's a good question. Honestly, I don't know. I guess it depends on, you know, where, if you're left-handed, where you feel like things may not be applicable, you know, where you may have a hard time applying what we're talking about to your own work. Ideally, it would be essentially the same, but I guess, you know, there's probably a sense that I started here and I'm working my way down because, you know, I'm going to kind of mess this area up potentially while I'm working. And so I don't want to finish this area, move over here, and then this, my hand here is kind of messing up what I had already created. Some people will protect an area using, you know, some sort of, you know, protective film like a parchment paper or something like that, or use a maul stick to help raise the hand off the surface. I don't really do that. It's just my personal preference, but you know, I think it perhaps, if anything, it perhaps affects the overall decision-making process about when to start and where. But the general process that I'm talking about here of building the whole thing up at once and trying to start from a point of unity, it should apply. So one of the things that I'm observing now is that the tip of the pencil is kind of lost its detail. So I'm kind of working on this background area, using the side of the pencil, again, rolling at my fingers as I go. And that's going to help me to sharpen my pencil. I'll get to that sharp point, so I'll have that available to me when I need it. And I think the way this drawing is going is suggesting that I'm just going to leave out that fabric. I'm just going to imagine that it's not there. I want to have some variation in the background, so I'm not going to make this a solid form. I'm going to gradually lighten up here, maybe get a little bit darker back in here. So I'm just going to use a lighter pressure up in this area. And I think the proportions are okay here, so I'm going to I think I'm just going to bring in some detail or sharper edges here in some cases, but let me see. I think I do need shading stump. Let me see. I'm noticing here there's kind of a shadow back here. There's a bit of a bounce light right here. So light's coming off of this orange and bouncing onto this surface. So I'm observing that, but I know in my head that there's a tendency to overstate that. And in particular, it's against this dark form here. So it's making that feel brighter than it actually is. I think I can actually darken this. It all should be part of the same shadow. If I make that bounce light too strong, it starts to feel like it's a different form altogether. So really trying to wrap these marks around the form of the orange to reinforce its three-dimensional quality. And in this case, I'm just going to kind of go right over this orange. I'm going to be able to refine that a little bit more, but I really want to make sure that there's an understanding that this orange continues behind the lemon. And then, let me see. Darkening this up a little bit. So as you can see, I kind of darken that bounce light. And now to establish that bounce light again, rather than lighten that area, I'm going to darken the area around it. So bring in a little bit more value in this form shadow of the orange here. I think, where do I want to sharpen up some of those edges there? How does that read? I guess it reads okay. Kind of soften that out a little bit. I think just like I did with the other one, I think I need to make sure I don't get too far along before I establish this stem. Art by Adam. Want a shout out? Absolutely. Welcome. Arena said, yes, it does. This doesn't look quite quite defined yet, so we're kind of setting the stage for it. Cleveland Lee is asking a question about charcoal. Yes, this is charcoal. This is just a single charcoal pencil that I'm using for this. This is a 4B General's charcoal pencil. So as I'm looking at this stem here, I'm trying to build into it. So I want to be careful not to create a hard line. I don't know quite where it's going. So as I'm making my marks, I'm kind of tapping along the surface rather than creating a solid, consistent line. And that will hopefully read more naturally. If I make too hard of a line, it can sometimes flatten things out. I'm going to get that white tip here just by pinching the kneaded eraser into a point. I need to apply a little bit more pressure though. It's not really lifting. How's that doing? There we go. And then I'm going to have to refine that a little bit more. And I just made that kind of just it's kind of straight stick. I think it has a bit of a bend in the reference photo, and I think that's actually really kind of important. So I'm going to take another stab at that, see if I can refine that a little bit more. All right, that's good. Good feedback from you, Nia. They're saying that you're talking about how the volume of the fruit is working. Again, this is kind of more of an atmospheric approach to creating it. So I mean, I could have approached this in a completely different way, and this is just my inclination at the moment. All right, so with that now established, now we have that contrast between that sharp edge there and that kind of atmospheric edge. And that's creating a strong contrast where that feels like it's just popping right off the page. So I need to anchor that down. And my instinct is to want to go in and sharpen up that edge there, but I want to avoid that. What I want to do is kind of build my way from this down into that area. So I need to make a physical connection between these two areas. So I'm going to look for some of the subtle forms in this part. It gets a little bit darker under here. I'm going to try to wrap that around. I've kind of lost the edge of that orange down there altogether. That's okay, because I can find that again, and we'll refine that even more. Right now, I'm just I want to tie this stem to that orange, make it feel like it's anchored there. All right, and then let me see, where's the bright spot? I'm looking for the bright spot in the orange here. I think it's right in this spot. It's a little bit hard to tell. So I'm just kind of tapping on that surface here, hopefully to convey a sense of that texture. Guess that works out okay. And now I can go back in and I can refine the edge by really working in that background, doing some negative drawing, working in that background up to that edge. You want to be mindful of halos. So as you're doing this, if I had when I used a harder edge in the early version that I showed you, with a harder material, it created harder lines around those edges during my earlier phases. And then that became really difficult later on. What it did is it just created these halos around that edge. There were just light areas that I couldn't quite fill in. So just kind of be mindful. If you need to, use circular marks that help to break that up. So I'm working from this area, coming into it to find that edge. And I want to be kind of subtle with it. I want to kind of sneak up on refining that edge, because I do like that contrast between sharp and blurred focus. But if it's too much, then there's too much separation. If there's too much detail, then it can kind of flatten out. So that was all very, very subtle, but I think it makes a big impact on the overall drawing. How's that look? So just stepping back. I like that. I think the three-dimensional forms are holding up okay. And now I'm just doing a double check on the highlights, the bounce lights, make sure that they work out all right, because I don't want those bounce lights to be confused for highlights. That's the thing that typically trips up artists, is we overstate those bounce light areas. I'm going to add a little bit of value here, darkening the value here to anchor that one down a little bit, sharpen up that edge, and give a little bit of weight. And I feel like that needs to happen here as well. A little bit of value just below, underneath the fruit here to anchor it to the ground. How's that feel? That feels all right. It feels a little bit better. Okay. All right. Let's see. Oh, I think I see what you're saying. So, Ingratia, I think that's your name there. I think I understand what you're saying there about the stem. Yeah. I didn't. Yeah, this is coming out a bit too vertically, but that's okay. I think I'm going to leave it for now, so we can move on, because I've already held you on for over an hour. I could change that. Maybe I'll come back to it a little bit later though and see. I want to move on to the lemon, which is the star of the show. So what I'm doing right now is really, I'm kind of smoothing out the background, but it's less for the benefit of the drawing and more for the benefit of my brain. I need to clear my head a little bit, so I'm just moving into an area that requires little thinking. So I'm just kind of building up some charcoal on the shading stump, smoothing this out back here. If I mispronounce anybody's names while we're working here, I apologize. Okay, let's see. Okay. Yeah, I appreciate the comments and pointing things out like that. So I just want to make it clear that if anybody is holding back on making any comments or observations, I hope you don't. That's something that we welcome in this community, is making your observations. If we're so we have comments about the stem, and that's all really helpful. It's good to be pointing out. You all have helped me in many ways, in many drawings, by helping me to define errors or opportunities for correcting things. So please feel free to provide those observations. If you say, hey, something looks off wherever, shout that out. It's important. That's how we grow as artists, is to accept observations from other people. All right, so here we're going to get into now, the lemon has a bit more of a noticeable texture. It's a bit lumpier. So my first pass, actually, I think I need to start with the stem here. And I think I do really need to observe the angle at which it projects off the lemon. It helps to establish that axis. Okay. Yeah, I'm sorry, I'm having a hard time following some of the threads here. It looks like everything's good, but if I'm missing any important questions, just let me know. I think everything is good here. I do want to make sure that I'm explaining things clearly. So as I've mentioned this in some of the previous ones, but if you're new, I view it, when I was a drawing teacher, I always viewed a student's ability to comprehend something. I would view that as a reflection of how well I communicated something. So if a student struggled with, say, perspective, I figured it was my job to find a better way to explain it rather than something that they were doing incorrectly. So I love the challenge of trying to define something in a new way. So I found ways that work for me to describe something, but it may not work for you. So if it's not coming through clearly to you, I'd love that opportunity to kind of clarify it a little bit more. So it just kind of gives you a glimpse into the way my mind works, but it would be foolish of me to expect that everybody would process the information and think the way I do. So now I'm seeing a difference here. So now I'm seeing a gap, all right, between this and this. And so, and that's really as simple as, so what I was just doing was a quick check-in, is this the right size? Is it too small? Is it in the wrong spot? And it is both. It's both too small and in the wrong spot. So I need to move this over. So before I do that, let's see. I'm going to kind of lightly tap in the area around it. Here's a thing that I had missed when I drew the stem in it originally, is I had taken my awareness away from the negative space around it. I got so focused on this specific form, I stopped seeing the rest of the form around it. So my next step here is I'm putting more attention to that negative space, the shape of the lemon around that, to see if I can now achieve a more accurate placement and size of that. Hopefully that makes sense. So I'm kind of sketching in the new one, need to erase out some of the old pieces. So especially if you're joining from another country where perhaps English is not the dominant language and you're struggling just because of a language barrier, let me know, see if there's perhaps, again, a better way for me to explain something. So I think that's really exciting to be able to have this opportunity. Okay, now I almost asked where my pencil was, and it was right in my hand. Yeah, that feels a little bit better in terms of its size and the placement. Okay. And I believe it was at, I can't quite remember who pointed out we were talking about the stem. So that could be something that's happening with the stems here. I don't know if I quite really nailed those in properly there, but I probably should have gone through the process that I did with this one on those. Putting more attention on the negative space, this shape around the stem. Now let's see, it feels a little bit dark. I really kind of worked it. So that's what I love about the kneaded eraser is I can just tap like that and you lift up that whole area. It's pretty awesome. Now the stem here, there's a three-dimensional quality, so I can see a subtle shift in value here. It's a little bit darker along that edge. And I want to be careful not to outline this edge and just kind of, you know, pick out little bits and pieces along that edge to define. Okay, I think that's working out okay. Now there's a little bit of a shadow under here. And I feel like what I need to do is actually lift off. I need to massage this a little bit more because there are contour lines there that are a bit heavy and I feel like it's flattening things out a little bit. So I need to try to get rid of those and attack that in a different way. So I'm kind of making a mess of the whole space around it, but I can try to clean that up a little bit later. So what I want to do now is I'm going to build this in as generally a solid shape of a fairly dark value, but not black. And then go in right here and the darkest part right up here to define that. And I feel that reads a bit better. And sometimes it's just a small thing that can make a big impact, have a big impact on the rest of the drawing. So just, you know, you have to kind of evaluate for yourself where you need to add that detail. And in this case, getting that stem right is going to be really critical. So I want to spend that time there. And I want to make sure that it reads as a three-dimensional object. So I want to be very critical of the way I was using line there. So that's what I was really doing. Yeah, well, I think so. It was a good question, or a good comment about making things not be an exact replica. So what I'm hoping is that throughout this, with this process, you can decide for yourself whether, like, how close you want it to be. And so for me, for whatever reason, I was fixated on getting this right. And when I had originally drawn it, it felt smaller and kind of too far away. It felt like it wasn't creating the sense of form that it required. So then I went back to the reference image and I said, all right, here's where it could improve. So now I'm at the point where I want to make sure it reads as a three-dimensional object. And I can be off, like, so for example, with this rough stem here, I could be off with that a bit, as long as this whole thing reads as a three-dimensional object and it's in the right spot. And for you, if you're following along, you may say that, you know, as your drawing is coming together, that it doesn't require anything more, or maybe it needs more detail, or maybe you just feel like adding more detail because it's fun. But you know, hopefully, again, this process is about putting you in control of that, and it could become a decision that you make throughout the process. Rather than starting with the idea that everything has to be in detail. So hopefully that makes sense. Good feedback here. Good to see some of you joining in late. All right, so now I just had to catch myself because I felt the instinct to go through and refine this edge. But I want to build my way from the inside out, I think, similar to what I did up here. This has become separated from the rest of the lemon, so I want to try to anchor that by looking for some of the subtle value forms in that area. So using the shading stump I find is a little bit helpful, more helpful than using the charcoal, because the charcoal is going to go right for black. You can make a little bit lighter mark by not pushing down as much, but with the shading stump, I can create a softer mark that allows me to kind of test out some of these forms a bit more. And then if I'm happy with them, but I need them darker, I can always go back in and darken them. So what I'm trying to do is kind of envision this form that's kind of coming out and around the the lemon here. And so there's two primary dimensions that we can look for. There's the longitudinal and the latitudinal marks that we can make. So those running from from the pole, from pole to pole essentially, or around parallel to the equator. So I'm kind of trying to keep that in mind in both ways as I'm working through the form. They run this way around the form, and they run this way. And I haven't erased out any of the highlights yet in this lemon, so I know that I'm kind of preserving the brightest brights for last. So I'm trying to build up the value first in some of these darker areas, and I think I kind of just need more. I just need more value. I need to add a bit more charcoal. I really enjoy some of these the questions that we're getting. So thank you for the new viewers who are shouting out with new questions. It's always fun to be challenged in new ways. So I appreciate that. You know, sometimes we have conversations going in a lot of different directions in this series. So again, hopefully you're not holding back if you have any questions or observations. Okay, so I just what I needed to do there was just kind of clarify that edge as I'm trying to really study how this form wraps around the edge. You know, I can see in the reference photo, there are all these really small details that I want to, I'm going to allow the tooth of the paper to suggest that rather than get in there and try to render that. But, you know, I do know, for some artists that brings a lot of enjoyment, the idea of really getting in there and getting all those details. So I'd hate for you to kind of suppress that in belief that that's bad. Go for it if that's your inclination. Again, for me, I really love it when texture is suggested rather than made too explicit. Again, it feels like the brain just gets activated by that. All right, I guess that feels all right. It's coming together. It's starting to feel like it has three-dimensional form. I see this subtle kind of line that leads up there that I need to get rid of because it makes it feel like some sort of seam in the lemon. So, and just as with the pencil, as I'm using the shading stump, I'm constantly rolling it to activate a new edge of that. Nia is saying, asking a good question, do I use the same amount of pressure with my pencil throughout the entire drawing? He's saying, I start off with a light pressure, but always end up pushing harder and harder by the end. Any tips? That's a really good, it's a good question. I mean, for me, I'm always adjusting the pressure throughout. I guess I always start with the weight of the material, and if it's not what I need, then I gradually add more and more. So for example, if I'm doing this, I'm laying down some material, it's not adding a whole lot, so I just need to push down and then it starts to lay down a bit more. And so that's really the way I approach it, is that, just start with the weight of the material, see what it's going to give you. And then if it's not enough, you kind of push it a little bit more. I noticed the reflected light here in the reference photo, but I feel like I'm overstating it in the drawing. So I'm gonna drop that down, just put a little bit of more value on top of that. Okay. Now, let's see, Mondays and Wednesdays. Yes, Mondays and Wednesdays, 3 p.m. Eastern, we do this. So I just figured out what I'm doing for the next 2 weeks. I completely forgot. I do know I'm doing a boat. I think that might be the next one. There were some suggestions on the last episode that I tackle a boat, so I'm going to give that a shot. I know I'm going to be working with some eyes, kind of facial features, one of a child, another one of an older man, and I really feel compelled to work with atmosphere. So I'm doing a mountain scene, kind of focusing on kind of these misty mountains. Oh, Barbara's asking about the mono eraser. This is one that I found, and it's Tombow makes it. It's a sand and rubber eraser, so it's rubber on this side and it's kind of sanded on this side. It's awesome. I really enjoy it. Oh, cool. Kathy is saying that kind of tapping with the shading stump helps to provide some of the texture. So, yeah, I think that's a good thing to share. I do want to now. Okay, so I'm going to pull out the light on this now because I do just see distinct highlights in this area of the lemon. And I want to be mindful of the form as well, so it's a little bit brighter in this area, gradually getting lighter, but I want to use this as a way to reinforce, again, the cross contour. So if I imagine those lines as established, I can make marks along those lines. They run this way and this way. And now I feel like that works out all right. It's got three-dimensional quality, but I do want to now define the edge, especially in the foreground. I want to keep this soft, so I create some contrast and allow this to pop forward. That creates some depth, but I think there's an opportunity under here to kind of refine this edge. And so there you can see a value here. That's going to become part of the lemon. I'm going to be bringing the this bottom edge here up to it. I'm going to find that edge. And you can see that along that contour, there's a lot of variation. It's rather bumpy. Let's see if that's enough to bring the rest of the object into focus. Not quite enough. I've really lost that edge. You know, the term that we use in kind of painting circles is lost and found edges. So the idea of an edge along an object coming in and out of sharpness. And I feel like it's too lost at this point, so I need to find it a bit more. And then maybe there's an opportunity to kind of add a contour line or something to play around with that. Does that read? Yeah, so that brings it a little bit into focus, but not quite enough. How does that works out okay? But I feel like in the reference photo, this edge is a bit more visible, and that's what I'd like to establish. And so I think what I'm going to do is actually drop a line in along this edge. See how that works. Oh, I like that. And then I'm going to carry this line down in here. So generally, you got to be careful with lines because they have the potential to flatten something out. So I'm being very careful as I go along that edge, kind of defining that edge using a line, but I want to make sure that it's not flattening out. And in order to achieve that, I have to have sufficient variation along that edge. You look at somebody like Sargent, and Sargent's drawings, he was really masterful at building a drawing that has 3 dimensions and light and value structure, and then adding a contour line in just the right spots. That is just, it's this sensuous experience. I love it. It really defines the edge, but and you can kind of be seduced by the quality of the line, but he doesn't sacrifice the volume that he created elsewhere in the drawing. So I'm adding a contour line to that lemon to pull that forward and make it a little bit more of a dominant star in the drawing. But I want to sneak up on that so that I don't overstate it. All right, I think that's about it. How do y'all feel? I feel like that worked out okay. I think the only thing that I'm evaluating is how distracting this background is, because it is a bit distracting right now. I get pulled to these areas of value here. So in order to help isolate the highlight, I want to make sure that the values in the background are sufficiently dropped. Sometimes these little white specks can be distracting. That's still feel like that's too much light striking down in here. So my approach to drawing is generally painterly, in the sense that I approach it the way I approach a painting. So it may not work for you. I think it's really healthy to just shake things up, and I should apply that as well. So I'll sometimes change up my approach to drawing, but that's kind of what we're doing here, is that we're all sharing our own experiences, rather than saying there's one way to draw, one way that you draw. So. A good question, or a good comment about still life with flowers in a vase and a piece. I have not done a still life quite like that, kind of that traditional still life, so that's a good one to throw in the mix, so I'll put that on the list. We've done flowers and we've done fruit, but not flowers and fruit. So I wanted to see Adele's comment that funny in surveying a contour line is a line that passes through all the same levels, but an artist edges the edge. Huh. That's interesting. Indeed. Yeah, so I'm glad that landed for you, Ingratia, about the contour lines. Yeah, it's really kind of tricky, and that's one of the reasons that I like to start my drawings by building up the values, is that because then I can be in control of the contour line. If I start with a contour line, it often becomes difficult to get rid of it throughout the whole drawing. Oh, this paper here is, I will give you the exact dimensions because it's European size, so it's 8.3 by 11.7 inches. They built it it's 21 by 29.7 centimeters. So it's kind of a unique shape. So, but it's about 8 by 12. It's probably the closest, or 8 by 11 and a half. So it's fairly small. A full human figure, Heather, yes. One day, I keep looking for a good reference photo that I can use for figure drawing. And that's been really kind of tricky. So, but it's something that I do have on my radar to do figure drawing. And that may have to be a multi-part series, I think. A historical object, it would be a good one. That's what Nia is saying. Maddie's mom, thank you. How can I get faster? I have 3 previous I'm still working on. You know, that's a really good question. I think I naturally work relatively fast. You know, I just, you know, I work at the pace I work at. I don't really think about it being good to be fast or slow. I remember being in art school and I would be done with mine and I'd see other people that look like their work is right at the beginning. And I kept asking you know, kind of berating myself saying, why can't I work slower? I would try to work slower and I couldn't. Because what I would see in their work is a much more precision, and I would look at mine and I'm like, I would do it quickly, but I would be off in a bit. And so I would force myself to try to slow down. So I just want to kind of put that out there, is that the speed at which you work, you know, there is no right or wrong way or better or worse way. So we all have our own way of working. Now, if you do want to speed things up, I think the best way to do that is to grab a sketchbook and do gesture drawings. You know, so whether that's a figure or objects, give yourself the challenge of capturing an object in 30 seconds, 15 seconds. Anything more than that is too much. That's when you start thinking. You want to be working so fast that you don't have time to think or evaluate. That builds up your hand-eye coordination, and it starts to illuminate for you what are really essential elements, and then you get really good at seeing those quickly, because then if you get that, then everything else is really kind of extra. And so I say that one of the areas where we should be spending more time on is in gesture drawings. We kind of undervalue its importance in the art making process. So give that a shot. Again, cap it no more than 30 seconds per image that you're making. I would go even less, go 10 to 15 seconds and try to do that. You want to shut down that thinking brain, because you know, I could work on this for another 6 hours and it would add more detail, but I've captured the form here. And that may be really all I need for this subject. And if I had 30 minutes, then I would have to do that within that time. And you know, you just find ways of saying, well, if I know that I'm limited in times, I have to cut something. What do I cut? And it becomes really hard to determine that without practice. So a gesture drawing gets you to that point, because you can't think your way through it. You have to just sit down, do it, and then from looking at the results, you realize which ones are working, which ones aren't, and the ones that are working, what information is being captured that makes it work. So hopefully that makes sense. Yeah, 10 to 15 seconds, it feels insanely fast. It sounds insanely fast, but it is, it was that's an exercise that I given myself in my undergrad that I found I think about very frequently. So what I had done is I set myself up. I would go to an airport where you could just walk in, or go to a mall and draw people as they walk by. And you only have a few seconds, you know, from start to finish. And it was the escalators that they felt like a luxury, because somebody would be standing still and I would only have from the bottom to the top to kind of capture them in that pose. And so after a while you get used to that, and you find that, oh my gosh, sometimes you'll get a mark laid down and you hit it and you've got plenty of time to spare. So you'll get to there at some point. So all right, I think we're done here. I don't know as if I can really push this any farther. I think it came out okay, but it's been a blast spending some time answering these questions. If you do have any other questions, this does go up as a video at the end, so you can always post your questions there, and I see those and I like to comment back. You also check out artistnetwork.com. So there is that link in the description below that will take you there. So go to artistnetwork.com/drawing together, and you'll find all of the episodes available there. So people have been sharing their work, and it's been awesome. So thank you all for doing that. I love seeing the work that you all have been sharing. So as soon as this show page gets posted, you'll be able to do that. Again, we are here every Monday, Wednesday, 3 p.m. Eastern. We will be doing, I believe it's the boat. Let me see if specifically, I want to make sure that I'm speaking correctly. Monday, yes, it's the boat. And then we have drawing of some eyes again. It's been a long time since I tackled those. So we're going to try that on Wednesday. Monday the 17th will be the mountain mist. And then Wednesday, we're working on drawing children's features, facial features, because that is a tricky one. So that's what's coming up. Thank you all. Have a wonderful weekend and happy drawing. So stick with it. I'd love to see what you're all working on. All right. Have a great weekend.